Hey guys, so we are looking at section 17.4 here, evidence of evolution. So we've spent a lot of time in this chapter talking about Darwin and his contributions to what we understand about natural selection and this process of evolution. Here we're going to talk about some additional pieces of evidence that support this theory, because in reality, this is still a theory. This is not a law. And there's nothing that we can truly do as biologists to kind of prove that it is a law. We just simply can't gather all of the evidence of all the living things that have existed on the earth. But what we can do is use the evidence that we have, and that evidence overwhelmingly, by and large, is going to support Darwin's theories. Okay, and so we're going to talk about what some of those evidence pieces are. So I've got several objectives here in this section. Let me go back. So we're going to look at geology first and the distribution of species in different locations and how that gives us an indication about how species may have evolved. We're going to talk about fossils and things called homologous, analogous, and vestigial structures. And then we're going to look at molecular biology kind of from that perspective and what we call embryology. And then we're also going to look at recent research that has been done on the Galapagos Islands dealing with the same types of finches that Darwin studied way back when he did his research more than a century ago. Okay, so biogeography is this concept where we are kind of integrating both the ideas of geology and land and location in geography, and also biology, which is the study of living things. So really we're looking at how these different species are distributed within a space. Okay, so when we talk about biogeography, it's a distribution of living things in an area, or in this case, the presence of fossils in different parts of the world. So when we combine knowledge of species in specific areas with what we know about geological events, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, those types of things, it can show us kind of how individual groups may have become separated, and then over time, how those groups may have evolved. And so we're looking at here what we believe to be are members of the camel family. And we have llamas here in one part of the world, South America. And the idea is that these original ancestors were up here, and then they've kind of diverged and went to different locations over time. And by moving to those different locations, which clearly have different climates, right? They had to develop different traits to kind of deal with that. So what was selected for in that case, those adaptations, those beneficial traits, became different for different groups. When we look at fossil evidence, this is evidence from fossils that we have found, right? That paleontologists have kind of dug up from the earth. And when we collect fossils, when paleontologists, obtain fossils, one of the things that they can do is something called radioactive carbon dating. And in doing that, we have collected fossils up to, billions of years old. And so the idea here is that Earth is much older than we had previously thought. So in Darwin's time, most folks didn't think that the Earth was that old. And to really kind of view Darwin's theory of evolution through this process of natural selection, you had to have a lot of time for that to occur. And so because at that time we didn't have an understanding of how old the earth actually was, it appeared that his theory was maybe a little bit flawed. But we know now that the earth is much older than was originally thought. And as a result of that, we can kind of further support his theory and say that, okay, this does maybe make more sense because we have had billions of years within which these species were able to evolve and change. Because if you're looking at a large species like this horse, right, we're talking about millions of years that it took to create this from an original ancestor way back here 60 million years ago. And through that process, you'd also probably have zebras and other types of horse-like animals coming out in different patterns, right? And so obviously, yes, requires lots of time. And so the fact that Earth is as old as it is kind of points to this idea that, natural selection is more likely. It's possible that did happen. So here's additional fossil evidence. We're going to look at here how we obtained whales, basically. And so we're seeing there's different types of words here, and obviously you do not need to know those words, so don't let those throw you off. But if you look at these animals that we're showing, these are prehistoric animals for which we've obtained some fossils, and we can look at some of these specifically. We know based on bone structure and location for these things that this organism right here called Ambulocetus could both walk swim in shallow water and walk on land. So it could do kind of both processes. It was able to live in both environments, though certainly not exclusively in the water like we see whales doing now. We have an additional organism here that probably spent most of its time in the water. You can see how its bone structures are changing and continuing on to the next. And then if we continue on this trend, and this is just the same diagram kind of extended out this way or this way to you, we have a Basilosaurus. We have, I can't say these to be honest with you, but we essentially have modern whale species that are forming over here in dolphins. And so what we can see is that there are these little tiny hind legs here that appear to have kind of just shrunken up in a way over time as these species became more and more acclimated and adapted to living in these marine environments in the water. And so the current understanding of whales specifically is that whales came from land mammals, that those were the original prehistoric ancestors, and that they essentially adapted and learned how to live in water. Okay. And it makes a lot of sense because we know that whales, for example, are mammals, and we know that they give live birth. And there's not a lot of examples of, other species that live in the water that are similar to that. And so for that reason, the fossil evidence is supporting those original theories and providing additional evidence to kind of drive them home. Okay. So I mentioned on that last slide, these little tiny hind legs here. We're going to come back and talk about those here in just a couple of slides. Those are something called vestigial structures. But in looking in some of this fossil evidence and in assessing maybe even where we are today with the living things that sit on this earth, one of the things that we can use as evidence of evolution and as support of Darwin's theory is these things called homologous structures. So homologous structures, if you remember, homo is a Latin root and it means same. These are similar or the same in terms of their structure or shape, and also then usually where they came from, their origin, but they are going to have different functions. So in other words, these are traits. These are structures that have been inherited and passed down from ancestors to future generations, even to different species. And what evolutionary biologists tend to think about them is that they must have been important in order to be kind of conserved and continuing on in that group. And so we can see here we're looking at some different types of what appear to be homologous structures. Now, the only way that I really know that based on this slide is just based on how these things are colored, right? I mean, it's obvious. This is coming from the textbook, and they colored these to try and make it very obvious that these are actually the same bone structures. But if you just kind of glance at them, they definitely don't look the same, right? Their structure and their shape look slightly different. The horse looks different from all of them, and the alligator and the frog kind of look similar, and nobody really looks like this fish, and the chicken clearly has got a wing, right? But what we do know about this is that these bone structures are actually very similar, okay? And so this is providing strong evidence for descent from common ancestors and for this shared evolutionary past. Okay, and so even though these things are used for different purposes, like the horse walks on its leg, right? The chicken uses its wing, or other birds use their wings to fly. An alligator walks on this leg, and a frog uses this. But notice the bending and the shape of these are different from a horse, right? So in other words, we've kept this structure that the most recent common ancestor of this is thought to be here, like an ancient fish. And even though we've kept these structures, they have developed different uses, right? Like a horse needs it for a different purpose. And so over time, what that shows us is that as these species and populations adapt, the structures that they inherit can also change in result of that, right? And they become more attuned to whatever it is that they need to be able to do for survival purposes. These here are called analogous structures. That's kind of the opposite of a homologous structure. These are things that appear to be similar in terms of what they do, in terms of their function for an organism, but they differ because they come from different places. So they do not share the same structure or shape. They do not have the same origin. So analogous structures, as compared to homologous, analogous structures do not provide any evidence for evolution. Okay, they only provide evidence for a necessity, for a need. So in this picture, you're looking at 4 different types of wings. We have a wing of a butterfly. We have a pterodactyl wing. We have an Archaeopteryx wing, which is a wing, which is another prehistoric bird-like animal, and then we have a bat wing over here. And what makes these very, very different is who they originated in, where they came from. So insects do not have bones. So this wing structure does not contain bones. However, bats have bones. They're also warm-blooded, which makes them very different from insects, but their bone structures are here found within the wings. The Archaeopteryx here also had bones, right, and feathers. And then the pterodactyl also has bones in this case. So what these organisms all share in common is not actually a common ancestor, rather it's a need to be able to fly, because for each of these groups, it became beneficial to be able to fly, maybe either to capture food or to avoid being eaten by a predator themselves. So these are going to be super important when we talk about changing over time and why that's necessary, but they do not show us anything about where these organisms originated from, where they originally came. Vestigial structures, I think, are like the coolest part of all of this. So when we talk about evidence of evolution, these are the ones that we could just go on and on and on and talk about. These are structures that were once used in ancestors in the past, but they're no longer used in the species and in the organisms that exist right now. So when we think about vestigial structures, I've got a whole bunch of different examples, most of which apply to humans. So humans have tailbones. Clearly, we don't have tails, right? That's not necessary. It's not needed for our survival. We have an appendix, right, down in the lower part of your abdomen, which really does nothing. It used to serve as part of the digestive system, but since we became more complex, we developed a more complex digestive system with multiple organs, and those appendices, the appendix that you have, is really not needed anymore. And it's so unneeded actually that it can actually cause more harm than good, right? If it becomes infected and swells up and bursts, that could actually cause an individual to die. So when we talk about an appendix, sometimes you hear people having them removed, and that can happen, and they live just fine afterwards because it's an organ that truly serves no purpose right now. Same with wisdom teeth. These were teeth that were developed back in the caveman era. You think about what they were doing at that point. They would eat raw meat and uncooked food. And so they needed to be able to kind of grind up that food. They needed more of the strength in the back of their jaws there. And so those wisdom teeth developed from that. But we're also seeing now in human populations that wisdom teeth aren't things that are consistently maintained. There are some humans that are born without any wisdom teeth. Like they never develop. They're just never there. We have some and every time I talk about this, I ask my students in class, there are some organisms that have like 3 of them. Some kids in my classroom will say, I know I have 3 wisdom teeth. And it's not that one was removed. It means that they were actually born and only formed 3 wisdom teeth. You have 2 or just 1. If you're like me, you're lucky and you got all 4 and you had to get all 4 removed, which was a total pain. But those wisdom teeth really serve no purpose. If anything, when they come in, sometimes they can alter the structure of your jaw and your other teeth, and that can cause a lot of pain and issues with your mouth functioning properly. So a lot of times they do get removed. And so over time, the thought is that those wisdom teeth will continue to be kind of pushed out of the way to the point to where humans in some point will no longer have those at all. No human will be born with those, but we're not quite there yet. Wings of flightless birds, right? They still have wings, even though they cannot fly. We're talking about like penguins that have wings, but they've adapted to using them to actually swim. Leg bones in whales, clearly legs do not exist on whales, but yet they have those hind legs that we saw in that ancient ancestor of whales, and they are still present in whale species, little tiny like remnants of the legs that were once there. Pelvic bones in snakes. So snakes don't have a pelvis, but yet they have like hips like a leg bone. And we have lots of species of fish and salamanders that live in complete darkness, but are also completely blind. But they still somehow have eyes, and there's not really a purpose for those either. They use other senses to detect where they are. And in reality, those eyes can kind of cause more harm than good if they get damaged or if they get diseased, and then they cause harm to the whole organism. Okay. So all these are vestigial structures. All of these are great evidence of evolution. They all point to a shared history for those organisms that have them. And they also give us ideas in terms of, where we came from and what our ancestors might have looked like and what they were using at that time. So switching gears a little bit, but we're still on this kind of in this vein of evidence of evolution. This is looking at embryonic development. Okay, so when we talk about embryos, those are going to be early stages of development, right? So before we actually get what looks like a baby developing in the womb, we know that species, animal species specifically, invertebrates, those species that have backbones, all tend to undergo the very similar series of events when we look at embryonic development. So what I mean by that is what you're seeing here in this diagram on the screen. You can see early on in development, which is like back here at the top, we have fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, and human. And if you were to just look at these organisms, chances are you wouldn't have identified really any of those as being a human. And then even if I told you one of these is a human, it would be hard to distinguish from the rest because they all look so similar at this stage. Okay, now as we move on in development to further embryonic stages, we get fish and salamanders that kind of start to look different. But your mammals over here, the rabbit and the human, look very similar, as do turtles and chickens, which are more closely related than they are to these. Continue along development, and then we can see our almost full salamander and full fish. And we have turtle now that has a shell, chicken that appears to lack that shell, but appears to start forming wings. Rabbit and human would still look pretty similar, actually, for all intents and purposes. So what this tells us then is that through this process, when embryos are developing, when vertebrates are developing, those organisms that have backbones are developing before they're born, we all go through a similar series of events, okay, stages of development, if you want to think about it that way. And there's a reason why we do it this way. For whatever reason, it becomes beneficial to kind of sit in this stage first and then develop this way and then develop into this. And this is something that we think has been conserved across all vertebrate species. All developmental patterns model, or this kind of models the developmental patterns for every species of vertebrate that we've identified. And so there's something beneficial about this process. And that is an indication that there's some evolution that must have been happening there, right? It slightly changed, right, as you got more and more complicated, but for the most part, it's the same general series of events. Molecular evidence, genetic evidence. So when we talk about genetics, remember that's looking at specifically traits that are inherited from parents that are passed down to offspring. And when we talk about genetics, we're really referring to the chromosomes and the DNA found within those chromosomes, what we call genes, being passed down. So what we're looking at here is several different types of species. This is a small kind of roundworm organism. It's called C. elegans. This is a fruit fly. This looks like some type of fish. And then we have a mouse and a human. Okay, and we're looking at the development of different organs and structures through this process. And so what we're seeing here, these are representing chromosomes, and then the little arrows here represent specific genes, and then the direction of those. And they've kind of tried to color code them so that we can kind of see, exactly where these things are actually similar. But all of these organisms here, and this is pretty consistent for almost every animal species, we have these genes down here that we call Hox genes. And those Hox genes, it stands for homeobox. These are genes that play a role in developmental patterns. And following those, you can see we have several other genetic sequences here that are going to be very, very similar. Those genetic sequences are kind of mapped to different parts of the body here. So you can see in a mouse and in a human, this is forming the spinal cord and part of the limbs, the hands and the feet. In a fruit fly, this is forming the segments of the body. In C. elegans, we get different organs and organ structures. But what's really cool is that all of this is coming from the exact same sequence, right? There's some modification to things as we go from least complicated to most complicated. But at the same time, the genes that are doing this whole process, the genes that carry the code to create all this stuff, are exactly the same. It's pretty cool if you think about it that way. So when we think about evolution as a whole, fossils are fantastic. Vestigial and homologous structures are great. Biogeography, those types of considerations are also certainly helpful. But what's most important when we look at evolution over time is going to be the use of DNA sequences and what we call genetics, just like this. So we know that for any species, passing DNA from one parent to offspring is certainly a very important event, right? DNA carries the code for everything we need to be able to do as a living and breathing being. And so that DNA code is going to be something that if we can access that and study it, it tells us a lot about kind of the recipe that made each one of us who we are. All right, the last little piece of this section is about a more current type of scientific study. And this was something that was done in the 70s. This is about a century after Darwin did his work and visited the Galapagos Islands. There was a pair of scientists that were married, Peter and Rosemary Grant, and I'm not sure, I'm assuming that they are still alive, but I'm not entirely sure. But they spent a lot of time researching on the Galapagos Islands, and they've since become pretty famous for their work there. And what they've kind of noticed through this process within, doing their research in the 70s was they were actually able to kind of track evolution occurring in real time. So they would monitor species and do things like measure the abundance of seeds, measure the hardness of seeds, measure the population size of specific types of finches. They were looking here at ground finches, the ones that have the thicker, larger beaks because they hunt for things on the ground. And then here they're mapping bird survival based on beak size. So we've got the percentage surviving on the Y and the beak size here on the X. So what they noticed was over the course of several years, when we had a drought, which tended to happen at some point, the result in terms of the effect on that population had a lot to do with the type of food that was available during that drought. So what it says down here, beak size in finches, and in turn finch survival, appear to be strongly linked to food supplies, the changes in which occur based on changing weather patterns. So if you had a very dry year or a very rainy year, that changed what types of food was available. So clearly here we had seed abundance kind of dropping off in a crazy way between 1975 and 1977. That was the drought kind of period. But over the course of that same period of time, the hardness of the seeds that were being produced increased significantly, and probably for survival of the seed itself to create new plants. What that meant for the population was we had this initial kind of surge in population size, but as that drought occurred, the finches started to die off at a significant level. Now, the ones that ended up surviving here likely had those most beneficial traits, which in the case of this scenario would have been to have those larger, thick beaks. And so those are the ones that end up surviving. They start to reproduce, and very slowly the population starts to grow over time. Same here. We have a very low percentage of individuals that are surviving that have beak sizes here below about 11 millimeters. But for those here in this upper side of the diagram that have the larger beaks, those are the ones that end up surviving. So this is, again, further evidence that kind of supports Darwin's theory in saying that, okay, natural selection is heritable, that's this word down here, meaning it is passed down. It's based on genes and what we get from our parents and then pass on to our offspring. And it's also dependent upon variation, because had these finches not had variation in their beak sizes, if they were all under 8 or 9 millimeters in size, none of those finches would have actually ended up surviving. Like the whole species would have likely just been wiped out. So having some of that variation, what we called back in the ecology unit, intraspecific variation between members of the same species in the same population, that becomes really important here. And as we can see with a single environmental change, it has a huge impact on their survivability. Okay. All right. So that's all I've got. All right. So test is coming up. Let me know if I can help you or if you have any questions on anything here. And I guess I will see you next time. Bye, guys.